Julia Haft-Candell lives in LA. She got her Bachelor of Fine Arts degree from UC Davis and her MFA from Cal State Long Beach. Julia shows her work at the Parrish Heinen Gallery in Los Angeles. And thank you for helping welcome Julia.
Should I do? Hello. Should I use the microphone or not? Yes. Yes. Okay. Maybe I'll use this one because then I can walk around. This makes me feel like a star. So hi, thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Sensini, and thank you for everyone for having me. It's been really wonderful being here and meeting everybody. So I'm gonna show work that's from before I started ceramics through to now, and so you'll see the progression, and it's changed quite a bit in terms of material and representation versus abstract and in between, but I think you'll hopefully see a common thread running throughout. So I'm gonna, and I've kind of segmented it all into, so I'm gonna start with the figure. And I'm starting with my childhood drawings because I think that those are probably the best drawings that anyone does is when they're a kid. Drawing and painting has always been the basis of my work, and I think it still really influences me now. And I would always draw people when I was a kid, and up until I started doing artwork more seriously in college. So I don't think that's my handwriting on top because I never would have written that well. But it definitely are my drawings, and I just found these recently and thought they would be nice to share. So I'm going to skip ahead to, these were like when I was 4, and I'm going to skip ahead to when I was in college, and I went to UC Davis, and I'd been taking drawing and painting. I was an art major and an international relations major, and I was saying earlier, I was mostly international relations because I didn't know what else to do. Like I wanted to do something like logical besides art, and international relations. It was a major where you didn't have to choose one thing. You could do women's studies, you could do poli-sci, you could do economics. It was sort of very broad, and I liked that because I was very indecisive, and I just liked learning things in general. But then I was doing drawing and painting, and I was making these paintings that were like very, very like thick oil paint, really trying to get 3 dimensions out of the paint. And then I took a ceramics class by chance, and I realized that I could make these sort of painted forms out of clay. And I thought it was really cool that I could make such a solid, heavy material do something kind of like emotional and gestural. I was making a lot of these I see them as very emo now, these heads that were on very long necks, these women that were thinking so much that their heads were sagging. And I was also saying earlier that the ceramics department at UC Davis was very experimental in the sense that we were discouraged to really use furniture, like tables and stuff. We were encouraged to make stuff on boards on the floor so that we would make really large things. We had to make life-size things from the start. And so a lot of what I made didn't even make it to the kiln. It would fall apart on the way to the kiln, and that really made me kind of appreciate failure for what it encouraged in work ethic. You just have to move on and make another thing when your thing breaks. And it's a good, really, philosophy for life. But I deal with failure of work pretty well still, where things will just fall apart, and I tend to not get too upset because I'm just kind of used to it. So from UC Davis, I went to grad school, and I think that's when I kind of transitioned to this less figurative for sure, less representational, more abstract system of working, and I was making these things that I called systems. I would like to also note that I never went into these pieces or this way of working with this kind of consciousness of like, now I'm making systems, now I'm making figures. It was all very intuitive and often very stressful, like not knowing what to make, but just kind of doing it anyway, or trying things anyway. And only in retrospect am I able to look back and say like, oh, this is a system, you know, and it's easier to look back and see that stuff. So more drawings from, this is like when I was at grad school and I didn't want to make figures anymore, so I started just making like a lot of shapes that were inspired by the body and by architecture, but a lot more abstract and fantastical. And in a similar way that I think glaze is really lovely because it's unpredictable. I don't know if you guys worked with clay or glaze, but there's a lot of unpredictability to it. Gouache and watercolor are really similar in that sense. I mean, it's not as unpredictable, but there's still a lot of kind of like washy things that happen. And I was drawn to using those materials for that reason. And in terms of influences, like in undergrad when I was making figures, Matisse was like my number one. He's still one of my favorite painters or artists of all time, but when I went to grad school, I started to be introduced to people like Jessica Stockholder. This is a work by her, and she makes sculptures, but she also has a painting background, so they're kind of like mixed media and very strange objects like carpets and lamps and string, but then it all has a very painterly composition. And I was drawn to that kind of strangeness of familiar, unfamiliar mixed together. And this was Long Beach. So Long Beach was a big move for me. I grew up in Oakland and I went to college in Davis, which is about an hour away. And so Long Beach being, 5 hours away by car was really far for me, and it was hard. I didn't want to make what I had been making in college, but I knew I needed to keep making artwork, and I questioned everything. I was like, am I supposed to be an artist? I don't know. But I think that change in surroundings and being in a really different atmosphere, different studio, different people really pushed my work in a new direction. I also really like this image just because there's like some port areas around here as well, there's Portland, but I think that I grew up in Oakland, which is also kind of an industrial port city, and something about the chaos and the organization in these port situations has really, I think, influenced my work, kind of unconsciously. So I started making these sort of choral forms. I never called them choral, that's what people called them to me. I just thought of them as these kind of abstract growth forms, and I was making them without necessarily knowing what they would go to, where they would go. They weren't finished pieces on their own. I saw them as kind of building blocks for a larger sculpture that would come later. So I would make a lot of them, fire them. This is them in the kiln before glaze, and then I would arrange them and create sculptures out of them. So this is in 2009, so I was like midway through grad school, and I feel like this is the first kind of successful piece I made in grad school after being there. I went to a 3-year program, and again, if you guys, hopefully we'll have a lot of time for question and answer at the end, but if you have any questions about grad school, I love talking about that kind of stuff. So like my program that I went to a 3-year program, so I feel like the whole first year was just kind of like a wash of just being confused and stressed out, and then the second year was trying to figure out what you're going to do. The third year is working on your thesis show. So this is about midway, and I had sort of come to some sort of realization of what I liked doing. So I see these as very inspired by Jessica Stockholder. There's this other artist named Sarah Z. Her last name is S-Z-E, and she also she still makes a lot of really intense installations out of found objects like string and matches and light bulbs, and I really wanted to create this really the most detail within the least amount of space possible. This is another piece around that time. So you can see within each of these are each of these pieces is one of those forms that was in the kiln picture before, fired separately, and then various ways of attaching them together. So there's like zip ties, there's sewing, there's epoxy, there's bricks propping it up. I didn't know how to move it from my studio space to the gallery. This is at the university gallery there for a student show. So I put it on some dollies, and that's just like furniture dollies, so the wheels are underneath, and that's just how it stayed, because I didn't want to take it off and try to and take the chance of it breaking. So, and I think this is also when I started thinking a lot about titling the work, because I thought the titles were kind of funny. This has a alarm clock and a table, so I called it the nightstand, and this has a flag, and it has wheels, so it's the bike. So the titles were a way that I could bring in a sort of familiar object, like a bicycle or a nightstand, something that's domestic that we all know, but then give you something that's totally absurd, and then you have to kind of make sense of those things and how does that work together. So titling is really important, and I think that even when you have something that's untitled, that's a title. So then I moved on from there and made glasses, and that was inspired by these two magnifying glasses up here in there next to the fan. I was really excited by fans at the time too, because they have this sort of animal-like, creature-like motion to them. And it's also sort of like an analog, outdated technology, but we still kind of use them. I was doing a lot of thrift storing and finding found objects in thrift stores and trying to find different ways to incorporate them. I also was starting to use a lot of mixed media, like these kind of sharp angles in the piece are just wood glued together with paint on it. This kind of wiry thing down at the bottom on the left is wire with unfired clay over the top. So I was basically just trying to figure out how to make lines in space, and not so concerned with like what I was making it out of. I just like had these certain sort of tools in my toolbox of like, okay, I know how to make some things out of clay, I know how to make other things out of these materials, and just kind of going from there. And another piece with the fan. So I think at the time I really wanted to get everything, all of my interests in one piece. So found objects, like objects in general I find really interesting, painting, drawing, detail, line work, the body, and I think these pieces attempted to do that. This piece, the fan started breaking, this fan on the table, so as it kind of rotated, it would start doing a clicking noise. If you guys know, like when fans start to break, and that sort of added a really nice component to it that I didn't have planned for. I think part of what grad school does is it makes you think about yourself. It's like part of why I think you should go to grad school if you want to go to grad school is because it's like your time. Ideally, it's like time to, especially for an MFA, you like try to figure out like, why am I doing this? And so I started to think about like my background and identity and all those things, and that was kind of interesting just because I hadn't really thought about it. Because my great grandparents and my grandma on the right, so my great grandpa Simon was a furrier and a rabbi, so he like made fur things and he was a rabbi, which I think is an interesting combo, and I'm apparently not that rare. And then Sarah on the right, they were immigrants from Eastern Europe to Nancy, and then changed her name to Nettie because that sounded more modern, and I just thought that was weird, you know, that at a certain time that was a more modern name. So I used that kind of information in my work and started naming my artworks after people as a way, again, to kind of familiarize what I was making. So this piece, without the title, is this kind of, it kind of reminds me of some sort of like alien perched on its feet. It's very precarious. A lot of what I was dealing with when I was making this piece was just how to make it stand. There was a pile of metal scraps outside the ceramic studio at Long Beach, and I would just go kind of scavenge around there and steal things
are those pieces of metal with silk or other fabrics that I would find at thrift stores sewn over the top of them. And then by calling it something like maple, it's again trying to familiarize something very strange and abstract. And also I think it's funny, and I think that humor is something that I bring into my work pretty regularly because I don't think that anyone should take themselves too seriously. And I think it's also a way of bringing me an idea of the absurdity of life, of how everything is so absurd, and especially in times of like strife and stress and war and all that. It's everything that we're doing, especially working in the studio, sometimes feels just so absurd. So by kind of acknowledging that, it was a way for me to deal with it. Later, I went in and I took this piece apart. Someone earlier today was asking, like, what do I do with pieces, or how do I take apart pieces? How do I deal with pieces that I don't have, that I don't want anymore? So this piece I had in storage, and then I didn't have any more room for it, so I took it apart, and I realized that this is how it was put together, with just like 40,000 zip ties. And I still think that zip ties are really great tools, but I really didn't know much about sculpture or anything. I think when I'm making things, like I know basically what I want to make, and then that kind of guides me to problem solving. And I think that's a totally fine way to get through art and life. Just like you figure it out when you need to. And if you need to ask for advice, I can ask for advice. But otherwise, like maybe you can figure it out with 40,000 zip ties. So then this body of work kind of led into post-grad school. I'm calling this body of work Terrains, with the idea of landscapes and maps and so a big influence in this body of work was scrimshaw, which is, I don't know if you guys know what scrimshaw is, but it's these bones, whale bones or whale teeth or some sort of bone or tooth that was carved into by sailors at sea. And this because they had so much time on their hands, and they would carve tiny little, and this is probably like this big or something, they would carve tiny little marks into bone or tooth and then wash ink into it. So it's sort of this etching, it's like an etching process, but out of kind of just necessity and out of like pure like needing to fill time. And then the other thing that I'm still very interested in is maps, especially kind of ancient ways that people made maps, because the symbols that are used are so arbitrary, where it really makes sense in terms of like communication. It makes sense to this culture, wherever the culture is, whoever the culture is. It makes sense of like getting from one place to another, but to us, these just look kind of like abstract drawings, and I'm really interested in that, in how it can be both. And I think in some ways, like language in general, written language is really, and symbols are really just kind of abstractions, and we start to like know them and take them for granted as ways of communication. So then this piece named Bustles, kind of sort of named after those big like bustles on dresses in older times, but named after sort of like a bodily part of the dress. And I think this body of work really started to simplify some of the shapes. So it was taking a lot of that kind of chaos. It's still a lot going on, but there's just less, and focusing more on the ceramic parts. So this piece is a big, big pile of porcelain chains sitting atop of a porcelain cube, with another thing leaning on the side. And then this top part going around, sort of framing it, sort of like as a figural, like a metaphorical frame and kind of a literal frame, is wood that I bent and then sewed silk over the top of it. So this chain will come back in more recent work, the idea of a chain, but at this time it was really just pushing the material, like making things out of clay that are not normal to make out of clay. So like a vase and a vessel, but these are just kind of like noodles and then formed into a chain, and firing them on a kiln shelf placed directly to the kiln and just making like tons and tons of them. It's extremely repetitive and tedious, and that repetitiveness and the tedium, those have really stayed in my work up until now as well. So this piece I named Rebecca after my friend Rebecca, and the top part is a kind of assembled, I think I have a detail next, bit of ceramic parts, and it's the base of it is a concrete block covered with silk with rebar coming up. So a lot of what I think about when I'm making these sculptures is like, how is it going to stand? Or I think that's a kind of a question in general with sculptures, like how's it going to stand? And if you want it eye level, how's it going to get there? And oftentimes we rely on a white pedestal, which in certain cases that's the solution that you want. You want a pedestal and then you have your piece and then it's at eye level. But I didn't know that, I don't think at that time that was what I wanted, to have that piece there. So I started kind of trying different ways. So in a way, this whole bottom part is like a pedestal for this top part, which I really wanted to be at eye level. And it just became part of the sculpture. So rather than seeing sculpture and the pedestal as two separate things, they really sort of fused into one. This is an installation of the show called Terrains that I had at this gallery called Acme in Los Angeles in 2013. And it was kind of like my first big gallery show, and I really tried everything. Like, I really wanted the installation to be more than just the pieces put in the space. And I still think about that. I still think of every installation as an installation, even if you make objects, if you make separate objects. How they are together in a space, how they are in any space, really defines the sculpture. Like, if you have something on this pedestal, it's going to look different than if you have it on the floor. And then when you have everything in relation to each other, it really starts to inform. So I wanted to create this sort of rhythm of a landscape with the show, including just this like triangular canvas thing on the floor that didn't really end up being a piece, but I really liked it in kind of relationship to everything else and how it brought energy down to the floor. And I was also using a lot of 2D with 3D. As I said, drawing was always has been a really big part of my practice, and so I started to incorporate it not just with the forms, but as actual drawings. So this is all one piece with this watercolor in the background, and then this clay piece that I called the letter because it kind of resembled an E, but with an extra foot, another form that comes back in more recent work. You guys have any questions so far? I'm kind of like plowing through this. Okay, so this was also part of that terrain show, but I felt like this work was pretty different compared to what was happening with the others. After making all those really narrow, spindly kind of really, I don't know, ephemeral forms, I just had the urge to make something really solid, sturdy, more like a traditional ceramic vessel, which is what I had been doing before I kind of changed courses in grad school. So I made this set of 4 pieces, and at the time it didn't really feel like it necessarily matched the rest of the show, but I see it now as sort of like a start of a new direction. And these were the only pieces in the show that were only ceramic and glazed and not other materials, and that felt kind of risky at the time because I sort of saw myself as this person that used mixed media, but I don't know, I just had to do it. And some of these, like this front one is probably about my size, and then they kind of go down in scale from there. But I see them as really important transitions between this body work and the current one. And then that led to this piece named To Pay. So I think it's funny, thank you for laughing, because of this piece on top that looked like a wig. But this was the first infinity that I made, and you'll see I made a lot of them since, and I didn't make the infinity form as like a representation of the concept of infinity. I made it because I was curious about the shape of it, about the form of it. I had been making all these sort of very spindly, skinny, kind of coral-like forms, and then starting to scale them up and have them be a little bit wider. And then, so the kind of potential for this like tube-like situation, see, it's still hollow, but the intention is for it to kind of look like it's just kind of like a noodly thing bending itself. And this is just red clay, not glazed, to really show the finger marks. Yeah, I kind of made that and then made a bunch of other stuff and then came back to the infinity idea way later, like more recently this past year, because it was something that still interested me. I really like, someone today also said it looked kind of like arms. Like I really like how bodily it looks, even though it's some other thing. I really like how stuff like the infinity sign can be abstract and representational at the same time. I also remember in grad school, a lot of professors would say, are you making an object or are you making an installation? And I wouldn't know what to tell them because it was kind of both. I feel like this, also, are you making abstract, are you making representational? Often I think we feel like we have to choose between one thing or another. That seems kind of binary, but I don't think that that really makes sense, or you don't have to. So then from there, I made this piece, which was, this was a piece that I made because I felt like I needed the work to function in some way, but at the same time I wanted to make a joke about function, and I think that's kind of a very ceramics joke, you know, because there's this idea of functionality versus utilitarianism versus not, and this idea of like, when does something become functional, and like, what is function, you know, like you can basically analyze that down to whatever you want. And so I wanted to make a big cinder block. So I did that. I made a big cinder block, just kind of inspired by the form of a cinder block. And I also made this basket out of porcelain, and I started in my studio burning negative thoughts in it. And so I would like write down a negative thought, and then I would burn it, and it would be super, super cathartic and satisfying. And then, and kind of like ritualistic, which I was into. I come from a family of doctors and nurses, and like my dad's a retired doctor, my mom's a retired nurse, and my sister's a surgeon, so everyone's like very sciencey, and I'm kind of like the one that's not. And they're also very, like we're Jewish, but we're like not religious at all. Everyone's just very like rational, and you know, like there's no such thing as this and that. So I sort of feel like my way of rebelling is to be super new agey, as like the one down in Los Angeles, and like be into horoscopes and stuff like this, crystals. So that was also part of it, that idea of creating a ritual. I had this idea of like this piece of fabric down at the bottom with that I like embroidered kind of, and then the idea was that you would like wear it while you burn. This is like a terrible image, but because it's kind of blown out, I guess, but there's a flame up top there. So it's also kind of questioning about like, religion and how arbitrary rituals of religion are, and like my favorite parts about religion are the rituals where like, you know, you don't really have to like believe things necessarily, but you go through the motions, and going through those motions make you feel better. I really think ritual is really important and a big part of my life, so in different ways, whatever your rituals are. So so then I brought those two together. So I was like, why don't I make a sculpture out of this? So this is kind of the residual of blown out. This is a little better. around 2013, around the time of that last show, I started to do more drawings, but they were a lot more simplified. And I want to talk about, like, in undergrad, people would, there's like your favorite artist and your least favorite artist, and my favorite was Matisse, as I said before, and my least favorite art was minimalism. I like really didn't get it. I was like, what's the point? Like, it was so dry. And now that's the kind of art that I'm really drawn to, is minimalism. And I think it's really weird, like maybe I was like repressing something, or like it's something about like trying to find what you can't quite get to, and I think because it's like so hard for me to not overdo things, that I'm really drawn to, minimalism, meaning like objects that don't necessarily don't represent anything besides themselves. So objects that like could be like a cube. You see these are like a white canvas at the museum, and you're like, what's the big deal? But those pieces now do something to me, and I'm not sure what or why. It has a lot to do with like an experience in space. Like they really need the space around them in order to function. And I think that's a really big part of it, and how they can also do so much with so little. And there isn't a lot of gesture or meaning that you can necessarily interpret from those things. It's just kind of like up to an individual and an object. I really like that. So anyway, that can kind of go into the more current work as I go on. And in terms of influences for, I'd say at this point on, Betty Woodman was a really big influence for me. And she recently passed away, but her work, she was making really incredible work. I think her best work in her 80s. She was 87 when she died. And she was my undergrad professor's teacher. So I kind of see her as like my grand mentor, like my mentor's mentor. And I see some sort of like a really large influence from her. But kind of in that sense of like, what's the big deal, but it does so much. Like, how can so little do so much? And also the way that she combines painting with sculpture and ceramics. And then Judith Mako is also, has been a really big influence in terms of pattern, in terms of kind of also that idea of simplicity of expressing an idea through pattern and form. And also just both of them in terms of just like how prolific they've been, how much work they made into a really old age. I just really want to be able to make work until I'm really, really old. So that's one of my main goals. Oh no. Uh-oh. My PowerPoint encountered a problem and needed to close. Let's try to reopen it. Any questions in the meantime?
Where do you get like your inspiration, like the color scheme that you have? See that there's like a lot of primary colors. It's intriguing. It shows
Yeah.
those.
That's a good question. A lot of it is intuitive and probably from what I'm looking at, from what's around me. So maybe I think a lot of the color I was using at certain times, maybe it was like the color of the LA sunsets or the smog, and I think about it for a while. I was kind of thinking about it as like the fashion of the time. Like this was the color scheme of the season. So I really like fashion, and so I was having fun kind of trying to connect it to that. But I don't know. It really kind of tends to vary depending on probably my interests. But it's hard to pin down what those interests are because they're kind of everything. Let me see if I can figure out how to play this now. Okay. So yeah, I think I'm really drawn to contrast in terms of color, and colors that almost clash but also kind of feel good when you look at them. Like sometimes colors do something to your eyes and they sort of vibrate or move together. Joseph Alvarez is an artist that has a really great, he's not alive anymore, but he made a book about color and interaction with color, and it's a lot of like optical optical illusions that are just based on color. And that's, I think, really interesting. Optical illusions in general are really interesting to me. But yeah, and you'll see in the more recent work as I go on, color sort of becomes more and more minimal for now. So, but at this point, I'm still making kind of like bright colors and through the titles, still kind of making them into beings, anthropomorphizing them, giving them body language. And this thing hugging the blob is sort of an eye pillow that I made. That's you guys ever go to like yoga classes and they give you an eye pillow and it's made out of lentils and it has this like weight to it, or like a neck pillow sometimes. It has this weight to it that I found so like comforting and like bodily. So I decided to make like a giant version of that with lentils and silk and make this kind of tube that wrapped around this sculpture. And then the pedestal for this is 3 IKEA tabletops, which is also sort of a play on minimalism because IKEA is sort of a like play on, like IKEA is like the cheap version of minimalist art, like it's based on minimal design, but then this is actually using the IKEA for the art, and so it's a joke. Yeah, so this is blob with handles. Okay, so now the image. Again, kind of playing with the idea of function, and well, it has handles, so does that mean that it's a functional object? Or maybe. And then I also at the time, around then, started taking, at my studio I have all these drawers of just like tiny little parts that are left over from making really large collage sculptures. Sometimes I have very like nervous, antsy hands, so I'll often just like make things without knowing what they're going to go to, and that leads to a lot of stuff. So I started making these mini sculptures in the way that I was making the larger sculptures, which I guess I didn't really explain before. For some of those really large sculptures, I was using fired ceramic pieces and this epoxy called Magic Sculpt. So in these pictures, that black section in the middle of things, kind of joining things together, black and white area, that's the stuff called Magic Sculpt, which is an epoxy clay. So it's a 2-part epoxy that you mix together, but it also has kind of like the consistency of clay. So, and then, but it hardens, you don't fire it. And it also attaches things together in a really fun way, so you can like literally make 3D collages. And so I started using that, and then I started etching into it. So these minis are only like this tall, but I think some of them are a lot better than my big pieces. We're also talking about scale today, and how like scale is just, you know, it just really depends on if you need big or small depending on what you're making. So then my most recent body of work is Infinite, and again, I just gave it that title afterwards, based on the exhibition that I had and all the infinity symbols that I ended up making. And this piece is from 2015, and it's the first wall piece that I made in this kind of way. I've made another one or two since then. It's this porcelain that I made into sections on the floor into the form of a knot. So it's really big, but in separate sections so that it's easy to transport. And then it has this pattern on it that I've been using a lot. That's kind of like the idea of a weave, like woven pattern, with like the warp and the weft, and kind of it being the basis of all like textiles. And then, so this piece was really key to kind of future pattern making in my work. So at this point you can see I'm basically back to just clay. And I think that sort of happened organically. Yeah. Good question?
How big is that?
This piece, yeah, it's about this tall. So it's in 2 parts. But you can kind of see in the middle where it's separated. But it's about, I don't know, that, whatever that is, 4 feet, something.
Are they stuck together
No. So a lot of the bigger pieces that I'll make them in parts so that I can fire them separately and then take them apart again for transport and storage. So they have this sort of like flange system where it's not just flat, sitting on flat. There's like a tube coming up from the bottom and then the top part sitting on the tube, so there's kind of a little bit more stability. So yeah, the clay is, I think what happened in the last kind of going through the progression is all my favorite parts of those big mixed media pieces were the clay parts. And it was cool making these really big mixed media things because of the complexity, but the parts that I liked the best were getting lost in the mix, so people wouldn't necessarily notice my favorite parts. And I realized that maybe that's more important to me than, like, for a while I think it was important to me that people would like get surprises here and there when they looked at a piece, and if they spent enough time on it, they'd get a reward. But then I realized, like, I don't know, I just want them to see this thing, and I want them to like get it. And I mean, even if getting it, I don't know what they would get. You know, it'd still be like confusion, but it would be they would see the part that I wanted them to see. So I think that's why I went back to working in only clay. Also because clay, you're making something out of nothing for the most part. You have like a pile of dirt and you're sculpting it. It's like drawing. It's like a line on paper. Whereas when you use mixed media, when you use other found objects, like even if it's like wire that you're sculpting into different things, it still has a history somewhere else that exists before you made it into something. And so I think that's another reason I really like ceramics. It's like it's really creating something. So I started making cones. This is another wall piece made in sections. It's pretty big. So another way that I can make really large things, but in my kind of small way, is making things in sections. And I started to make a lot more kind of like if you think back to those 4 pieces that were in 2013, I see those as really being leading into this series where it's kind of like I give a monolith, you know, like one big symbol meaning something. What it means is not always clear, but you know that it's supposed to mean something. And I like the directness of it. And then through titling, you can start to invent different meanings. So it creates, through titling, you can kind of create narratives, and I like doing that in a way that can really create something more kind of comforting for the viewer when there's something really kind of strange happening out of the material. This piece really reminds me of this kind of tension with ceramics, where there's this idea that of mastery over a material that I think gets really kind of over-romanticized in materials like ceramics and photography, miniature making, anything that's really process heavy, where just because you know how to make something a certain way doesn't mean that you should. So just because you can make something really, really, really smooth, that's really good, and sometimes that'll be useful, but it doesn't mean that that's what's good for the art piece. So I think as an artist, you have to kind of keep questioning yourself is this, just because I can doesn't mean, or just because it took a really long time doesn't mean it's good. And that's a constant struggle, because I think we kind of reward ourselves for spending a lot of time on something. But sometimes something that you just drop on the floor can be the best thing that you ever made. And it's really terrible that that's sometimes true, because it has nothing to do with you or your time, and that seems to be how we value artworks. And then sometimes other times the piece that you spent a year on is the best thing that you've ever made. You just think that it's totally arbitrary in some ways. It really depends on what you're trying to do. So anyway, I have a Venn diagram on here that seems a little out of place at this point, but I started to write about my work kind of recently, and I always had to write artist statements, and I hated it because I was trying to it just seemed really hard to like create something very linear and linear out of these thoughts that I'm having that I'm making art about, right? Like, why should I write about it when I can make art about it? But then writing does this very different thing in a really useful way. It just uses a part of my brain that's like not always happy to do it. So first I made a Venn diagram and started thinking about these two opposing things of confusion and comfort and how those things kind of come together in different ways and how I like use different aspects of confusing and comforting the viewer. And I started to make this list. And you know, when I look at it now, it's like kind of like, it doesn't really make that much sense, but then at the same time, like what kind of Venn diagrams really do make a lot of sense. I don't know. But you can just keep that in mind while I show you the rest of the work. I think it explains a little bit why I do these outdoor installations, especially this one. So this was an exhibition on the roof of my studio in 2015. I was making a lot of work, and this is something I've kind of always done, is like make the work even when you don't know why, like, or what it's going to. If you wait till you have an opportunity, then you'll never make the work, and you'll never have an opportunity. So kind of just like kept making work and not really knowing, and I didn't have a show coming up, but I wanted to show these pieces. We just moved into this new studio space that had a really great roof, so I thought I would just show them on the roof. And I think in retrospect, I see that I was really excited about showing them in a weird situation. Again, like sort of how the titling and the sculpture create this like confusion and comfort. In the same way, showing sculptures that are made out of something kind of familiar like ceramics, but on the roof of somewhere in Los Angeles is totally strange. And I like that confusion. So it was really a great experience. I mean, part of it was trying to bring in, again, like the space around the pieces, so the landscape around those sculptures is really becomes part of the piece. So there's like this big cemetery behind my studio that kind of looks like it's in another place, but then like there's also a lot of industry and these like big radio towers behind this other piece that just happened to kind of mimic the shape of this piece. I didn't put it there without, I didn't see those until I put this piece there. So it makes you kind of see your surroundings in a different way. And the other thing that was kind of fun about this, well, besides I had to rent a scissor lift, which I had never done to get these pieces to the roof, none of those like mechanized lifts, which you can just rent. Anybody can just rent, and they don't even care, and they don't use the driver's license, and they don't tell you how to use them. You just read the user manual, and so that was fun. And then also I made these pedestals also out of IKEA tabletops that corrected for the slant of the roof. So you can see there's like this thing that it's sitting on, and I was really proud of those pedestals as a way to kind of make the pieces more stable. So these pieces were part of this installation, but they also function on their own as sculptures. And I thought it was important to photograph them both outside and inside to show, you know, both, because they're very different in terms of where they are. Again, this one's probably about 4 feet tall. At the time when I was making these pieces, I was teaching out at Scripps College in Claremont, California, and about 30 miles east of LA. And there was a kiln there that had about a 4-foot span, so I could make things in 4-foot sections. My kiln now at home is like less than 3 feet, so I can make things in smaller sections. Yeah.
How are you doing this with this?
Good question. This piece I fired a few times. A lot of these pieces I fired multiple times. So this was probably fired once with. So it was bisque fired. So this is some ceramic lingo, but it was fired once before any glaze, and then I think I put on 2 low fire glazes on top of it at once, and might have fired it again with another glaze kind of globbed on top of it, but using really, really thick mixed glaze. No, it's glazes. Oops. So you can kind of see, like, well, hard to see, but a lot of them have really goopy surfaces. Okay, so then this piece was, in 2016 I went to the Skowhegan Artist Residency, which I recommend everyone applying to if you if you are interested in residency. But it's in Maine and it's 9 weeks and it's all different mediums, but it's definitely an experience. And I think it really made me, this project was kind of planned before that, but it really kind of made me more confident in terms of just like trying anything and doing anything, which I think as artists we kind of just need to be a little bit reckless in terms of like, I want to do this and I don't know how to, but let's try it. So this piece I was commissioned by this nonprofit art group in LA called Clock Shop, and it was they have this land on the bank of the LA River, and LA River is just kind of like is just a cement kind of wash, and at parts there's a lot of greenery and wildlife, but at other parts it's just kind of cement. So it's kind of, and this specific spot was a rundown or ruins of an old train depot. So there's like old sign parts and weird tracks, and these 4 palm trees were just headless palm trees, and I thought that they would be a really interesting thing to incorporate into my sculpture. So I decided to take from those chains a while back that I still had in my studio. I still had a pile of porcelain chains, and I decided to make a giant chain made out of foam and aqua resin, which is like a healthier version of resin, and denim. So those 2 materials, so they're basically just cut from foam, each link, and then kind of glued back together once I licked them all, and then suspended from these palm trees. And the idea, again, is it's not just one idea. It's complex, like everything, where the idea of the chain is something that can be decorative, it can be something restraining, it can be something damaging, it can also be something like to help lift or pull or link. So all of those different meanings really are in this piece. And then the denim I also found kind of like a similarity in the way that it's sort of like a functional but also decorative textile. So this piece I made out of these other materials because there was no way to really make something of this scale in ceramic, and also this space where the piece is installed or was installed is completely unsecure. Like there's a lot of vandalism there. There's no, it's just kind of like a Wild West over there. So everyone who worked for the organization was pretty sure that if I made something out of ceramics, it would be broken. So this was really interesting to use a different material, and foam was really cool in how lightweight it was, but how you can still kind of sculpt it in a specific way. You can kind of see the denim strips here. Basically, I didn't want it to just look like foam, and I didn't want to just paint aqua resin on, so I decided to use a fabric to drape over the top of it, and denim seemed like the best match. And also someone had donated a big roll of denim, so that was useful too. So, questions? Yeah.
Just curious for space, how wide are your strips that you're covering them? Just trying to like.
They're pretty small. They're like this, so it was a lot. It was a lot of.
Yeah.
It was like paper mache.
Did it turn out how you pictured it as far as the, I'm sure you had to go out and measure the distance from the furthest palm trees and then figure out how big your link's going to be. Did you get to a point where you're like, I'm so sick of making these links, I want this to be done, or were you like excited the whole time?
I was tired of it, but I was excited at the same time because it was looking how I wanted it to look. I was excited by how it looked, and I wanted to see it. So I didn't get sick of it until way later. Yeah.
How long does it take?
It took a long time. It was basically all I worked on for I don't know, 3 months or so. And I was teaching too, so it wasn't every day, but it was most of my time. It was kind of crazy. And I did have some help once in a while, and I had help installing it. And it was really precarious installing it, but it was really interesting. The whole experience was really a group of people rather than just myself, and having something out in the outside without being in like a gallery or anything. And it made me think a lot too more about like, I made this giant chain, so I better think about more like why I'm making chains, you know. And so that also kind of fed into all of these images are they look really cool now? No? Okay. Maybe it's just my angle. I think it's just my angle. Okay, so this, thinking about the chain, then I had the opportunity to show with this gallery that I currently work with, and this show had been planned for a really long time, I don't know, like a year or so, or maybe a little more than a year. I knew I was going to do the show, and I wanted I didn't want to just do like sculptures in space on pedestals. I wanted to do like a kind of specific installation. And I decided to just focus for the most part on this idea of infinity. I had made knots, I had done an infinity in the past, I had done chains, and the form that was still really kind of exciting and encompassed a lot to me was the infinity, and then different versions of that. So I just made a ton of infinities. I made them out of all sorts of different clay, and then eventually settled on this one kind of clay that fires to be this really black color with a white surface on top of it that I would carve through, and I have some details for individual shots that I'll show you in a minute. But I had a bunch of drawings of infinities on my wall in this grid in my studio, and I decided that I wanted to create an installation kind of mimicking this idea of drawings on the wall or a big painting, kind of creating a mural out of individual sculptures so that they are individual, but they also work as one whole thing. So that's what I did. And so they're all on their individual little triangle shelf. And at the same time, coming from, if you remember that Venn diagram, that was kind of the start of what became this glossary, and I brought a couple. I made this glossary of terms and symbols for this body of work. Basically by, again, like not aware of why I was making these forms until, until I kind of self-analyzed myself. But looking back and thinking like, okay, why am I making the chain? And so I made definitions based on some reality of what chains are, but also how I perceive them. And I was really inspired by some specific science fiction writers for this body of work, like Ursula Le Guin. And so I think I was talking earlier about how art statements were always really hard for me to write. I think because I was always trying to fit my work into pre-existing kind of theories and histories, and that never seemed to work. It always felt forced. So through reading a lot of fiction and science fiction specifically, I realized like I could create my own kind of theories for my work, and that's how I kind of invented this glossary. So, you know, in my definition for a chain, I talk about how, well, first of all, I talk about everything sort of like these opposing forces of like a dash, which is a line, and a torus, which is the kind of donut, and those two, like male and female, kind of are the basis of everything. And then how like the infinity is kind of both of those forms into one, and the chain is also kind of like this intersecting of masculine and feminine. And then also how it is about restraint and restriction and bondage, and like, you know, there's like all these kind of terrible connotations with chains, but then also like the idea of hoisting and lifting and linking and pulling and kind of helpful connotations too. I made faces, I made legs based on what was me in gymnastics. So I did gymnastics for a really long time. The legs were inspired by kind of depictions, kind of cartoon depictions of feminine form, but also these diagrams that are kind of pixelated up there, but they're kind of diagrams that are classic gymnastics diagrams of the proper ways to do figure, like sort of have your legs, have your body in these forms. And I found kind of analyzing that gymnastics also is this really paradoxical sport where it's like girls are expected to be like very girly, but also like stronger than anybody in the whole world. So I just kind of like got really personal about this stuff and thought about what I wanted to make and how I defined certain things, and if I just wanted to make a lot of legs, and I did that, or faces. So some of these forms are more like, I call them coming infinity because they're kind of like almost, imagine them kind of like on their way to tying themselves into these knots of being infinities. So water, eyes, combs, braids, weave pattern, arch pattern, scales. So these are all about this big, and the clay is black, and then there's white underclays on top of it. So it's like a matte surface that then I carve away. So it's like an etching or a wood block where you're etching away all the negative space. And negative space, I think, is something that's really key in my work. And then they're fired, so then they just kind of have this texture. The like kind of surface has texture of the carving away. Knots. Oops. First. And then as a counterpoint to those infinities, I made these pieces called weights that were kind of supposed to represent like the voids in the infinities, so like the donut holes in the donuts, and it kind of tied into that whole idea of paradox that is really present in my work. And also they're made in a very kind of counterpoint way where a lot of these pieces are made from, when I do the infinity forms, there's a lot of carving and etching and all that negative, the clay coming from that, I would recycle, and often they would turn into these forms. So they're literally made from the recycled clay from making the infinities. They also are like, some of them are really solid, they're heavy. If you didn't fire them very, very slow, they would blow up, 'cause like you're not supposed to do that in ceramics, you're supposed to make things really hollow, but these aren't. So they're fun for me because of that as well. But they also kind of, we're talking, in terms of what I was talking about before, of like mastering the material, they do something really different, and they use a really different kind of muscle than making the infinity forms. But they're still ceramic, and they're still probably like valid in their ceramicness, even though they're not, they're just supposed to be kind of like a pile of clay. And then this piece, when you first walk in, was a wall piece, kind of like that one I showed you before, pretzel, the big walnut. But this one was an infinity and built on flatter pieces. So again, each piece is maybe just like this big and very thin, and then they just screw onto the wall together. Yeah, and then a little Bizarro comic at the end that my mom sent me, just to end it all. That's the end. Thank you, and I love questions.
I have one, the chain link fence. I actually saw that a while ago and was inspired to do like sort of public art piece myself. So
Cool.
it's really cool you're here talking. I guess seeing that you put your pieces on top of the roof and then in nature on the LA River. Is there sort of like something that's drawing you out to put your art in the world outside of the gallery? And if so, would you like to push that further? And what is that?
I guess so, because I keep doing it. But I think rather than it being, I think in general I like seeing unexpected things, and that's something unexpected that I can kind of create in the world. So maybe instead of putting my work in the world, I want to kind of see how my work and the world interact. And because it's not always important that people see it. In those cases, like, I like that people see the work, otherwise I wouldn't be an artist, I would just make it in my closet or whatever, but it's not so much for more people to see it. But as I'm saying that I don't know, there is something exciting about people not intending to go see art, but seeing art, you know, and
There's so much vacant.
yeah. So yes, I guess so.
It's really cool. I mean, from a distance, when I saw your pieces on the roof, I was like, oh, you must be by the Watts Towers or something, because I thought they were. I've never seen them myself, but it started to look architectural.
Yeah, the
It's
Watts
really
Towers.
activating
Yeah.
to see your work just unexpectedly in scale.
Thanks.
It's cool.
The Watts Towers are these towers that this guy made in Watts that he was kind of just using a trained artist, just kind of defined as like an outsider artist, but where he just made these really giant towers made of like cement and broken plates and metal. And they're really cool. I think he did them in like the 50s or something, a long time ago, and they're still there. Yeah.
Have you always had the courage and motivation to share your work, or are there pieces that you're like, ooh, I really want to show the world?
Oh yeah, no, there's a lot of editing. There's a lot of editing, especially now, like the longer you make artwork, the more you can edit, which is good because even like if I did this lecture a year ago, I might have shown you different things, but at this point I'm able to look backwards and see things that I know are more interesting to look at least or more interesting for me to talk about. And there's a lot of things that don't even make it out of the studio. I throw them away or crush them, recycle them. So yeah, there's a lot. I'd say it's